We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest on the interview series, Emily Olinger. She's the Chief People Officer at Monolith. Emily, so good to see you. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly we answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Emily. My pronouns are she, her. I wanted to do a lot of things when I was younger, but I'd say probably the most surprising one, and the one my parents gave me a lot of feedback about, is that I wanted to be a prison psychologist. I thought I could maybe make some impact in people's lives, and my mom said no. So instead, I joined HR.
There you go. There you go. Fast forward to today, you are in HR, you're leading the people team at Monolith, and it's in the name of the interview series, and a lot of conversations are happening about it right now. Company culture. How do you think about measuring company culture, which is a dynamic thing, especially as people continue to join and leave an organization too, in both a qualitative and quantitative way?
And probably one important note about my background, I'm actually an analyst and probably a mathematician in many ways. So the quantitative side means a lot to me. And probably one of my career missions is to figure out, how do you measure not how in sync or in function is your culture, but do your employees feel your culture is representing what you intended to? And I guess my maybe best way to describe that is, I think employee engagement can sort of distinguish, are you in function, like are you doing what you intend to do on behalf of your employees, or are you dysfunctional with what you intend to do with your employees? And I think that's slightly different than you might have a set of core values, or you might have a culture that you believe in, but are your employees feeling you represent those certain qualities? If humility is an important aspect, can they assess and say, against what we believe humility is, yes, in fact, we meet that sort of criteria? Of course, surveys can be designed for that. I do think employee engagement is a critical metric, again, for that temperature check of, are you in function? And the other one I would say that to me is really important is regrettable turnover. So are you keeping the employees that you really need to keep, and making sure you're really watching for where you might have either high performers or high impacting culture contributors leaving the organization? To me, that is way more critical of a metric than even just broad turnover. Just making sure you've got that kind of pulse on either key talent retention or regrettable turnover. Qualitatively, I could talk about this quite a bit, but for me, it's mapping across each point in like the employee experience journey. So do we have an intentional plan at each of those important milestones? And can we define at each of those milestones or those stages what people think, feel, and do relative to our culture? So at the point of a promotion, how do we want that person's experience to be in their transition as it relates to our culture? How do they think about it? How do they feel about it? What do they do? As we think about the managers, that manager change is often really difficult. How do those managers transition from the existing to the new manager? How do we experience that? What do they think? What do they feel? What do they do? How do they plan for it? All in accordance to our culture. So I kind of look at it as that mapping, and really being very intentional in thinking of how your culture shows up at each of those different stages.
Absolutely. It's definitely, you have to look at its stages and also not look at kind of metrics and silos as well. So there's not a one size fits all approach to it. Is there alignment between, what you're saying and what actions are being celebrated as well? The culture at an organization that is always kind of moving to. You mentioned those culture contributors. I think that everybody has a role to play as well, but especially, managers, leaders. In your mind, what is the unique role of the chief people officer to really be a culture conduit?
Yeah, such a good question. I think probably before I answer it, I have probably two important views on culture. I do believe culture in the workplace is a living and changing energy. I don't think it's set in stone from when a company begins to when it's, 50 years into its establishment. I think it has an evolution. I also don't believe culture should be aspirational. I think it has to be a reality. It has to be how you show up, behave, think, feel, all those things I shared earlier. In my mind, from a CPO perspective, I think culture and the role that we play is you have to be really attuned to the reality. You have to have those kind of fingertips, those pulses into the organization to be able to assess, is what we plan for and intentional about what we are seeing and realizing. And I think the CPO has to be that sort of voice and again, that kind of fingertips into the organization to know if we're in sync and to know when we have gaps. I do believe in most parts of a growing organization or even a stabilizing organization, there are things that you need to work on in culture. I kind of view it like routines, right? If you're like me, maybe it's not so easy to stick to a workout routine. And so sometimes you're just so good at it, right? You get the 5 days in, you hit everything that you really wanted to, you eat the way you want to, you drink water the way you want to, and then you have a slump in your health and you realize it takes work to get back into that routine. Or if you have a lifestyle change, how do you change into that new lifestyle, the right health routine for you? And I think culture can be that way too. So as we influx new people, it stretches and changes our culture. So it may inflate or deflate at times. And then you've got to figure out, how does that shift, especially as a chief people officer, how does that shift be seen, and how are we, really keeping our eye on it? And then what do we need to do in order to get it to where we want it to be? That doesn't mean it's got to fit back into this mold of the past, but how do we really assess where it should be? I also believe a chief people officer's role is to really sit with the leadership of the organization and have a level of accountability to what culture shows up like with our leaders. If our leaders don't exemplify our culture, it is really hard to expect everybody else to show up that way. If accountability is a crucial part of your culture, and let's say the CFO doesn't follow through on commitments, that's not a real part of your culture. It's not showing up in the way that you intend it to. So I think that's another probably critical area that the CPO has to have a strong voice in, has to be really comfortable seeing and showing up that way, and leaning into the leadership especially.
Absolutely. Accountability is really important, especially that modeling behavior from senior leaders and executives as well. And then in terms of really having that continuous growth mindset, being able to be flexible and pivot with your company culture as well. It doesn't fit nicely into a box either. And it's not a set it and forget it as well. There's always something to be working on. I'm sure you and your team are working on many, many different things. But if you were to share, one or two, what's the next problem or situation you're currently trying to solve at Monolith right now?
Yes. Well, outside of learning, because I have a lot to learn about my new organization. And so I feel like I'm in constant learn, stretch, self-awareness mode just for me. But I'd say there's probably two big things I'm looking forward to deeply thinking about, planning for, strategizing. The first is, how does our organization scale over time? So as we think about sort of the stage we're in, we're about 180 employees. We have a lot of projects and potential to really expand and grow. And that means we need to be thoughtful, not only about, hey, what roles are coming next, but what roles might exist into the future and where do they exist? And how will these teams work effectively together to make sure that as we bring in, amazing talent, that it doesn't cripple us because our organizational infrastructure is just not ready for it. So I'm spending a lot of time with leaders just trying to look into the future, make sure we're thinking about where the org is going. And then part of what we need to do is really say, how do we share that with the organization so they can also broadly ready? How can we help them see this capacity of a role you have today is going to evolve, is going to shift. It might specialize, you might gain direct reports. You might have to add an entirely different function to your team in order to be successful. So just helping think through what does long-term look like there, and then how do we pull it in today's sort of state of mind to be able to help people prepare for it. The other big effort I'd say we have coming up, and it has a lot to do with, I think, where many companies are, is what does workplace and work experience mean to us in the future? The pandemic obviously shifted so much for every company, and while we've rolled what I would consider a traditional sense of rolling back into the office, what we haven't really defined is what it means either to come to work or not come to work, and truly kind of digging into the roots of what do employees need or struggle or can gain from, with whether it's in-person interaction, travel, even thinking of remote teams, like how can that be really valuable, and really thinking of that entire workplace and work experience as one unit of, it doesn't have to be we all go back to work. It doesn't have to be that we're all remote. And what can it mean to just do it really effectively, especially because we're in a manufacturing setting where we do have employees that have to come to work. And we also have employees that have a high requirement for travel. And so we need to sort of find this new way we function in order to be successful into the future. And whether we like it or not, the pandemic gave us that opportunity, us as organizations, that opportunity to say, what did we learn? And now what does it mean to shape that a little bit differently for our organization to be most effective?
Absolutely. Having the opportunity to redefine and just reimagine, rethink about kind of what does success look like, what does setting people up for that success look like as well in terms of resources, frameworks, definitions, and really support and guidance. I think that we've also seen a shift in the role of even of language too, for human resources to people experience, to people analytics, to culture and talent teams as well. Where do you think the current perception of human resources is today? And where would you like it to be in the future?
I think today we have gained credibility as being adaptable and being more than an HR police center or an HR happiness center. I think prior to COVID, we were sort of bucketed into one of two camps. You were either a really high, we only go to HR if we are in trouble, or HR creates all the fun, nice stuff. Like it seemed like it was in that extreme. And I think we've gained some credibility in our ability to adapt. If you look at, how HR had to respond to COVID, we had to learn an entirely new function in a matter of days. And my best analogy is, if you think about it if you were in accounting, within weeks, you would have to learn the GAAP accounting rules when there is no one that can teach it to you and no one that has a best practice. So HR had to sort of learn this entirely new function with really no assets except our own ability to try and figure it out. And that's where I go, like, we did gain a lot of credibility. I think we gained respect in our ability to help companies thrive. So being sort of that ability to think, how do we survive something this challenging? But I also think we help companies think about the compassion that we need to be able to share during really difficult times, whether that was through COVID, through an opportunity to really expose Black Lives Matter, like you name it, the conflict that we're experiencing in Ukraine. Like there is just so many opportunities where I think HR has helped companies show their compassion, but also show how they can thrive. My aspiration for the future of HR is that we're business leaders. We are seen as strategic. I think we are seen as having a seat at the table now, but I think too often that seat is designated in a people area. And I'd really like to see HR just simply being seen as strategic, strong executives in the business, no caveats. I'd love to see more HR professionals move into business roles. I'd love to see more business professionals move into HR roles. I'm one of those, and it's been the best experience that I could possibly have in my career. And I'd love to see more CEOs with HR backgrounds. I think we are as strategic, as strong of business leaders as any other functional area of a company.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we're hearing as well, which is why a lot of folks are and were kind of burned out as well, because everybody was coming to them, whether it was employees, CEOs, other leaders as well, to say, how do we solve this problem? What do we do here? And that seat at the table has expanded as well. And it's just a necessary kind of partner to the business, because I would argue that people are your greatest assets at an organization. They're the ones working on the product, service, they're working with customers, they are day in and day out part of the organization. I know in the past, you have also had a lot of experience scaling up human resources teams upwards of 70 people, is incredible. And now you're doing something similar at Monolith in terms of growing the team. Are there any key learnings from scaling your team that might be helpful for our listeners who are in a similar position as they begin to grow?
And especially because I'm sort of re-experiencing this, right? I'd say first is thinking of the business. I don't think any HR team should be sort of a rinse and repeat build. What industry you're in, what the goals are for that business, and how those goals translate into how HR can help support, I think, are really critical in thinking about HR structure. A way I would think about it, so if your technology team is scaling quickly, how would HR be impacted by that? Obvious answers: recruiting's impacted, onboarding's impacted. You're probably even going to lean in on leadership development. Those are kind of straightforward areas. But how would you think about the business partner role? Should that be brought in earlier ahead to help leaders really plan for that growth, ensure it scales, the talent is retained, support all the change management that comes along with that scaling? Or do you bring it on after and make sure that they can help sort of be effective in the implementation or later years of that? So it's important, I think, to think about, hey, what are those sort of key goals? And then how do those goals translate into how the HR team should show up? I think conducting a gap analysis often with your HR team is really important. Where do you have strengths? Where do you have gaps? To know where you could index talent in the future, or where you need to develop your team. If you have a really lean HR team, you have to make sure your probably strengths are very general and broad, but then you've got to figure out as it grows, where am I gaining sort of those specialties, and where do I need that specialty concentrated? And how do I think about the team as a whole, but that specialty to generalist structure may differ in certain areas. You may specialize your recruitment team sooner than you would your learning and development organization, simply because you have a lot of hiring to do. And so it's going to require all those breakouts of either functional or location types of recruiting, high volume versus executive. Like, you may specialize that area before learning and development. If you have a big gap in terms of HR support across multiple sites, you may specialize that area first. So just thinking of where specialization should happen, again, against those business goals. And probably my biggest suggestion on figuring out how you grow the HR team is checking for value. Are you finding your team is pulled proactively in to help solve business challenges, or are you pulled in when there's a problem that is sort of too late in the game? And I think most HR folks know when that's happening. It's more a matter of, are you really assessing, are you brought in at the front stage of when things really have an opportunity to be solved? And is your team being stretched and asked to be involved in more or different things, probably than they have capacity to do? To me, that's a sign that there's a high value of the HR team in their ability to truly help lead people strategy and work with leaders in order to kind of build that out, or work across the organization to build that out. And I don't think that checking for value is a survey. I think it's a pulse and hearing through one-on-ones what your team is interacting and doing.
Absolutely. Checking for value, seeing kind of when you're brought into situations, you really want to be proactive and you want others to be proactive and bring you into the conversation too. And you definitely can't rinse and repeat. Again, not a one size fits all approach from organization to organization, from role to role, from year one to year five. I know we also talked about this in our previous conversation, but for folks who are listening, how have you been involved in the organizational design of the team at Monolith overall?
Yes. I would say obviously early involved,
Yeah.
but it's been one of the, especially the first efforts I've really needed to help leaders with. So probably primarily defining how our organizational design will work and facilitating the process with leaders. For me, I think when you think about org design, it has to be more than just putting an org chart on a slide. I think you have to help leaders lift their heads up, define the vision for the team, establish and connect the goals to the organization. Like I said, with the HR team, doing that gap analysis, where do we have strengths? Where do we have opportunities? I think it's helpful for leaders to define what triggers my growth. Is it a volume of sales? Is it a new location? In HR's case, is it headcount? Like there's different triggers for growth that I think are important to define even before you start trying to put an org chart together. And then, yeah, to me, there is a viewpoint of thinking through your org in a current state versus a long-term state. And my biggest piece of advice I try to give leaders is keep names off of it. And the reason for that is those individuals will matter a lot as we gain and understand the org chart, but trying to place people with positions when you're trying to think long-term can either be really detrimental to the process or detrimental to their careers because you sort of lock yourself in mentally to that. So I think really thinking about the roles that are important. And then as we gain and progress towards that org design or that org state of mind, we can better do a job of saying, okay, who's ready and prepared to take on that role? One of the things I need to work on next, especially with Monolith, is figuring out how do we communicate and align that across the organization. There's so much to be gained by the individual groups sort of going through that org design effort, and how can we help the broader company see this is where we are going, and these are functions or teams that will exist, and these are how things will shift and evolve within our structure over time. So just really doing a lot of deep thinking on how do we best communicate that. And then making sure I'm doing the best I can in a consultative approach, challenge leaders, help see connections in the org or breakdowns in the org, and try and make sure I'm digging in on a little bit deeper dialogue. I'm new to this role and new to this industry, so I'm feeling, I'll call it weaker there right now. But I think that's one of the things I would expect to be able to do in the long term is just how do we consult and evaluate, challenge, push leaders to really think about where they should be going.
Yeah, thank you for providing that context. It's definitely a large project, requires that deep thinking, kind of a lot of different moving pieces as well, and a lot of internal questions to ask in terms of where we are and where we want to be as an organization, and whether it's with org design, whether it's with the intentional growth of the team. I think over the last few years, a lot of folks are auditing the employee experience, they're auditing job design, and thinking about how can we make this the best experience for everyone, knowing that people are at different points of their career and life as well. Can you tell me about how you've redesigned a system to be more equitable in the past, whether it's a process, policy, or initiative?
Yeah, and I'm going to caveat to say I'm not sure I've done the best at this, honestly. The one thing I can share is I fell into something that helped give me some good, probably self-awareness on my opportunity to be more forward thinking about it. We discovered at my previous organization a few years ago that our health benefits were really supportive of the LGBTQ community. And I was so excited and elated to hear that. And I did, a little like, yes, I'm so glad about that. And then as I was driving home, as I usually do, thinking about things, I realized that wasn't intentional. We fell into it, and I'm grateful we fell into it, but it gave me a lot of like, oh crap, you've got to really think about this differently than you probably have. If you're celebrating something that you fell into, it means you didn't intentionally necessarily design for it. And how could you do a better job of that in the future? So I'd say that's a big working on for me, and making sure I'm thinking about where we need to plan for things, but also being really thoughtful about, hey, it's great that we fall into things naturally, but it's not great if it's not intentional. It's sort of not as great as we hope it would be. I do think there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm early into some of our benefits here at Monolith, but there are a couple that we're working on right now that we recognize as potentially having more opportunity to be equitable, and how do we best position those so that our folks do have that sense of feeling of equal, but also making sure that isn't a challenge for them from a retention perspective. So yeah, unfortunately, I'd say I fell into some, and I don't love that answer.
No, I think this requires also some, again, like the reflection, the questions we ask ourselves. And I think that sense of you have a lot of kind of internal awareness too, and being in a leadership role, I think there has a lot of impact to be had there as well. I know we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics in our conversation today. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring any takeaways you hope people really bring with them?
Um, Probably the one I'm most passionate about is designing culture. It's difficult work to really think about those life stages of your organization and really intentionally think about how does your culture fit into them. I think using, whether it's perks or sort of the fun stuff of like birthday cakes and t-shirts, I don't think that's a fair representation of culture. It can be connected, sure, to your culture, but I think really being deeply thoughtful and making sure you're thinking about those employee experience life points and how does your culture show up. And again, not in the sense of celebrate the birthday, but in the sense, and if that's great, celebrate the birthday, but in the sense that when someone onboards, how are they thinking about our organization, and how are they seeing us show up as they're so early in their career or at the end of their time with the company? How are we exiting them in a way that reflects our culture? And making sure that's a consistent thing that you're just sort of always looking at. I couldn't talk about that enough.
No, absolutely. I think those different life stages of the organization, also the employee, making sure from onboarding to the last day at the company to when they're an alumni to the candidate experience, it's all really important. It needs to be intentional. Emily, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.